Okay, this intro, I decided to blend our intros. Are you ready? Howdy, internet.
Greetings,
I made
Internet.
myself laugh.
Greetings.
Howdy, internet. Greetings, internet. All right, this episode should be a juicy one, a riveting conversation. So we're going to talk through what we loosely call our power brokers or our power players or our most influential companies in semiconductors. So we both published on this. I wrote a post a little over a year ago called the Silicon Big Five. I took a lot of flack for who was not on that list, but I'll just briefly lay out my theory. So I looked at it from really who made the brains. So just thinking that the brains is one of the most important parts of any computer, data center, car, client, smartphone, etc. And that is then CPU and GPU, right? Two parts of that equally. But I also used my logic of who had proprietary IP or innovations around those two areas that were essentially in some area of control or influence or power within the industry. And I took that, even a little bit further in just looking at why CPU and GPU, because obviously, right, everything we make is a symbiotic relationship, and it requires a lot of different coprocessors, memory controllers, power management, etc. But the back of a lot of the innovation that we see, you could argue most of the innovation that we see, from apps to data services, developers writing tools for X, innovating, is generally on, the CPU and the GPU. People aren't writing apps for memory controllers or display drivers, etc. So if you point to the kind of things that spur innovation or drive innovation, it comes from the advancements of companies who do something interesting and unique, or in this case, proprietary, in CPU and GPU. So because of that, my list was in no particular order: Apple, Qualcomm, Intel, AMD, and Nvidia. So that was my broad thesis. You include some companies that people gave me flack for not including on my list, which I think is a good form of discussion, because I don't want to discredit, right, the innovations of everybody. But that was my logic for laying out who I had on that list, who I thought was influential and was sort of the spear of innovation, and again had something that was proprietary, defensible, and really unique in terms of their differentiation, in this case in architecture, for CPU or GPU. So there you go. That was my broad explanation that people don't have to read, because I just explained it, but I think I did a better job talking about it than reading it. Maybe I won't take as much flack this time.
All right. So I published first on a similar topic I looked it up in 2015, but I used a slightly
2015.
different 2015. I used a slightly different criteria though, right? Because in
Okay.
2015, everything was collapsing. The whole industry was consolidating. And so I was like,
Right.
well, who's going to be left in 10 years? And every few years since then, I've updated that list. And after I saw your post, I updated it, and I have a different list. So it's a different criteria. Um, I'm looking for
I want to hear your list from
semiconductor.
2015. Give me your list from 2015.
I'll look it up. Where to go? But yeah,
Or
so
loosely just name a few of them. It's fine. I'm just curious who
yeah,
you had pegged
who was on my list?
almost
All
10
right,
years ago.
Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, TI, and NXP.
Okay.
And I love that I had NXP on that list because like 6 months later, Qualcomm was trying to buy them. Right?
Almost did.
Right?
What an
Yeah,
acquisition that would have been, man.
almost, almost. So my updated list is where'd it go? My updated list is Qualcomm, ADI, and Texan, two, but I'm counting them as one. The analog duopoly.
Yep.
Nvidia, some Chinese company to be determined, and whoever ends up with the smoldering ruins of what is today Intel.
Okay. So walk me through your criteria.
My criteria is survivor. Who's going to survive? Survival, right? Which
Okay.
companies have the staying power that are still going to be in the industry 10 years from now, right? And so I took Broadcom off this list. They've been on it since I did it. I took Broadcom off this list because they're not a semiconductor company anymore. They're a private equity fund, and at some point, private equity funds like to exit things, right? And so at some point, that will get dismantled. That's my theory,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Qualcomm, I think we both agree on that one. Qualcomm stays on that list,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Just, Apple can have a modem. Qualcomm's still going to make many more of them.
Yep.
Nvidia, we both agree on Nvidia. Nvidia,
Yep.
if anything, Nvidia just looks stronger than it ever has. Nvidia was not on my original list,
Yes.
and I remember, like, as soon as I published, I was like, oh, I forgot about Nvidia. But 2015 Nvidia looked very different, right? It was a
Yep.
GPU
Yep.
company then. It wasn't like GPU, right? GPUs weren't taking over the world yet. But I
Right.
remember thinking I probably should have had them on. But
Sure.
I agree. Nvidia is, I think, fits both of our criteria really well.
Yep. Yep.
And I like your addition of Apple to the list. Like it's a little funky. It doesn't fit in my criteria, but I think if you're ever going to talk about semiconductor companies, you have to include Apple. They're the best. They're
Yeah.
the best run semiconductor company on the planet right now.
Yes. So why did you include sorry, did you say it was ADI?
I include yeah. So I kind of cheated. It's a top 5 list with actually 6 names on it. I say ADI and Texas Instruments. Right?
Okay. Combine. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, not like they're going to
So
merge, but just like both of them are going to be around for a long
right.
time.
So I'll tell you the 2 companies that I took flack from that aren't on your list too, and kind of just tell me why perhaps you didn't include them. Right? I know why I didn't. One of them's ARM, and the other one was TSMC. And other people said you should include ASML because obviously ASML's probably not going anywhere. But anyway, I have, based on my criteria of kind of who controls the dominance and the influence, those are ingredients to me than necessarily the spears of the innovation. But obviously, no one goes anywhere without those 3 companies. But I'm curious, what's your take on that? Do you foresee a different future for those 3 companies?
So I sort of I view TSMC and ASML at this point as like foregone conclusions. Like you don't even need to put them on the list. We're just all going to assume that they're not going anywhere.
Right.
Yeah, I can't even conceive of a world in which ASML is not crucially important.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed. Whatever. When do we get to FUV? Right. Who knows? Who knows? Whatever comes next. Maybe, but like that's like literally made up. So, right. So those 2 are solid. They're not going anywhere. I can't see, absent geopolitical madness, those 2 are rock solid. I will push back a little bit on ARM.
Okay.
I get how they would fit in your criteria of platforms upon which other people innovate. But I think that's very much in question right now. Is ARM going to be around in 10 years? Probably, but there's an alternative now. There's RISC-V, which is I don't think RISC-V will entirely displace ARM, but I do think
Sure.
there is going to be a growing tension between the 2, and it's not clear who's going to really hold that power. Right. Plus,
yes,
I think ARM has given up some really important markets like IoT and embedded. I don't think those are
Yep.
coming back. I
Yep.
think they're at risk in AI inference. A lot of low-cost devices will be AI inference engines, and they're going to need something cheap like RISC-V, and that works pretty well. It's cleaner.
Yep.
So I think
Yep.
there's a lot of reasons to question having ARM on that list.
Interesting. Interesting.
Right.
That's good. I mean,
Plus,
I would.
I was going to say plus there's lots of confusion right now about what their ultimate model is. Right?
Yeah.
You have Qualcomm openly saying that they want to port all their mobile libraries to RISC-V in 10 years, over 10 years.
Yep.
I'm not sure, that may just be posturing ahead of the lawsuit, but still, like, the fact that they're even talking about that publicly is a big
Yep.
question mark.
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, and obviously, right? 3 of my 5 are ARM architecture licensees. I have always tended to favor ARM architecture licensees over standard architecture implementations. Not to say that what MediaTek does is not good or innovative, or obviously, right? Broadcom and Marvell are now more in generic IP than custom architectures, more so than they used to be. Um, it just seems like we talked about a number of themes in past episodes of how to control your destiny, you really need to do something different. Doing something different does require some architecture, and that's why Qualcomm's going back to custom architectures. That's the whole point of the Nuvia acquisition. It's actually one of the reasons why I'm quite optimistic about Qualcomm's future, is because they're reinvesting now in a custom architecture that's going to allow them to be innovative, differentiated, take a unique core, something that stands out from others, compete on it, really push its innovation and push it into many markets. Like, that's a strong spot, right? A lot like Apple, but supplying that type of quality architecture to a various number of companies. So again, it kind of feels like, yes, ARM's there, but some of the most important people pushing the ecosystem forward are architecture licensees doing their own architecture on top of the ARM instruction set. So not to say that it's not irrelevant to ARM, but I'm just placing the power back in those who have control of their architecture, and then again are building the innovation engines on top of what they've designed, right? Both to the degree on top of ARM.
All right, let me push back on that, because one, I think there is there's just a bias in the sampling then. If you're saying the most innovative companies are the ones with architectural licenses, by definition, the only people who can afford architectural licenses are the biggest companies.
Mm-hmm.
And so
it's true. It's true.
I'm worried that we don't want to fall in that trap of just saying bigger is more innovative, because that's contentious. But the other thing is, by your logic then, if architectural licenses are the future to innovation, then that argues very heavily in favor of RISC-V becoming more important, especially if ARM really goes down this path, like they're rumored to, of like cutting off architectural licenses.
Yep. I mean, so one, you're right in it moves the bias. I just don't have a good example of somebody who, again, not to just say what MediaTek does isn't innovative, but there's not a ton of proprietary technology there, and there's not going to be another MediaTek. Like, somebody else isn't going to show up and displace MediaTek. Like, MediaTek is entrenched as the largest, ARM shipper of chips at volume, and they put together things cleverly. And in fact, one of the things they have that is actually one of the most, in my opinion, the most differentiated piece of IP is their PMIC, their power management IC. But the cores themselves, right, are just whatever ARM puts out. They sort of just turn around and implement them. That's why you look at what, and honestly, like Marvell and Qualcomm, and Broadcom used to be in that camp. They used to do a lot. They were custom architecture licensees, and they've skewed away from that. And obviously, Qualcomm went back to a semi-ish custom, and now they're going back to custom. Just again, because for the same point that I agree with you, RISC-V is going to become more influential, is just because people have to control their destiny. And I don't know if you saw the news a couple of days ago. It's rumored, maybe you knew about this, I don't think I knew about it. Google's pretty close to their own custom ARM chip for data centers. And I'm pretty sure they're an architecture licensee. And it will come out that is. Now Amazon's not. I think you've made the point that what Amazon's doing in Graviton is innovative. They're just shipping standard IP. But they weren't on either one of our lists either. But they're also doing it in a very, very specific implementation. So, I mean, I do agree. It skews people who can afford it, which, as we've talked about, is not a lot. But it does lead to where I think, I do agree that RISC-V becomes a much more important platform for people to design their own solutions and then use that to much more differentiate the systems, because it's only going to get more competitive, not less. And that's why I think skews to these much more custom implementations.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'll tell you, actually, I struggled a little bit with MediaTek. I wanted to put them on my list,
okay,
but I couldn't quite figure out where to put them in. So I threw them in as an honorable mention, right? Partly because the whole point is there's consolidation taking place, and they're
right
in a different ecosystem. They're not going to get consolidated away.
Nope.
But I think it's a fair point. Like they're not an architectural licensee. They're not known for their sort of really, really forward-thinking, disruptive innovation.
Yeah. To be honest with you,
at least in terms of silicon architecture, I think their business model was really
it's great. Absolutely. Yep. And I mean, again, and they're dominant in several categories. I mean, they're the leader in IoT in terms of volume. They have the majority of shares. I think it's 75, maybe 80% in smart TVs. Nobody's going to displace them from smart TVs. And obviously they ship a ton of smartphone parts in the sub $500 market, and they could move up, right? And honestly, like, I actually think if there was enough quality architects out there that MediaTek could get, I actually think that they would strongly consider becoming an architecture licensee and doubling down on unique innovations around CPU, probably not necessarily GPU. But I wouldn't think that's off the table if they could hire the people. I just don't think they can build that team. And arguably, Qualcomm couldn't build that team without buying it, which I think is fascinating, because, again, they used to have a custom core. And I was completely against. Like, I argued with their management at length, and to the point that, like, I got in trouble with them. They were like, stop badgering us. You're annoying. But I was like, you should not step away from your architecture, your custom architecture, because it's gonna hurt you against Apple. And sure enough, it did. And now they're back in that game. But they acquired a team to do it. And I think that's telling, like, how hard it is, to get the kind of architects that can go and do these things. Now, again, maybe RISC-V gets a little bit easier. You don't need quite the manpower, but the best CPU architects in the world aren't just sitting on a couch. They don't without a job. Like, they're employed somewhere. So you have to acquire these teams to do this stuff.
Yeah, you struck a nerve there, because I know that the Qualcomm architecture team, and they all get let go, and literally overnight they got jobs. All, what it was, 300-400 of them, all got jobs overnight at AMD, Nvidia, and Microsoft.
Microsoft.
So yeah.
So Microsoft's got some architects, huh? See, that's a question I want to get to at some point, not now because it's not on our list, but, like, when's Microsoft going to start making custom cores? I mean, again, you got AWS doing it. You got, obviously, Google doing it. The person we have on our list, Nvidia, is, making a data center CPU on their own architecture license. Like, that's not going to be a generic IP. That's a huge deal, And so it's like, you look at who's got these pieces, and and I do want to focus on Nvidia actually for a little bit, so maybe we'll come back to that. But my point about Microsoft is, like, why everybody else seems to be making custom chips. Like, where's the Azure? I know you guys have an architecture license. I know it's not public, but I know you have one. It's rumored to. Like, no one can confirm this with me. I just have a very strong belief, so I'm not saying something that's not a very strong belief that Google and Microsoft have them, but no one's confirmed that. But yeah, they could, right? They could make their own cores.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good podcast.
Other topic,
in the future. We'll look at the cloud, the hyperscalers.
let's talk about Nvidia. So I mean, you look at them and I'm like, every time, the stuff that's going on with AI, right, with ChatGPT and this boom that we're seeing and how hard it is to own a foundational model, and it's all happening on Nvidia. Like, I just don't see anybody even really threatening their dominance. Like, I keep racking my brain, like, who's going to come in? And I mean, they have, I want to say, north of 80% share in GPU in the data center for all this stuff. And in ML specific tasks, it's probably quite a bit higher. But like, I don't see them. I saw somebody tweet the other day, like, it's like a sure bet that Nvidia becomes $1 trillion company, which is probably likely. But I'm just curious, like, I mean, who could even challenge their dominance in the data center? Like, I just don't see it.
I mean, their only competition, I think, is internal silicon, homegrown silicon. That's who they compete against.
But on the GPU?
And we're not seeing that in the GPU, but we are seeing it in GPU in the data center. Isn't for graphics, right? It's for AI. So
right.
We're seeing, TPUs instead of GPUs. That's the only competition there. I'll tell you, in the training market, I think their share is, close to I think it's above 90%. Yeah, it's close to 100. Right. I think Google has a TPU SKU that does some training, and Amazon has Trainium. But other than that, like, I think even those companies do most of their training on Nvidia. And that's a pretty sizable, that's a huge market, and it's really nice margins. And then on data center inference, yeah, even companies that have accelerators still use a lot of GPUs.
Yeah.
Right?
Inference can move to CPUs. I would agree with you with it. There's parts that can be accelerated. It just feels like everything they've done, CUDA is so entrenched now in deep learning applications, which was one of the smartest things. I mean, I've been in lots of rooms with Jensen when he just rattled off stuff that I was like, that's one of the smartest things I've ever heard. And you're just building his logic for GPU compute, and why he was so convinced that GPUs are the best general purpose technology in terms of just compute everything. Like, I was just sold by his vision. Like, I mean, when you're in a room with the guy and you're listening to him, you're already captivated. But like, I was like, dude, that's exactly right. Like, you've nailed it. This is exciting. Like, I'm totally on board. And then the whole strategy for CUDA and how wide it went, is just the whole thing. Like, yeah, they are.
I think it's a little ironic because CUDA wasn't created for this. Like,
that's true.
They almost stumbled into it.
That's true.
CUDA was for a very specific other pain point 15 years ago.
Yep.
And it just so happened it was just what the market needed for AI. And so what they're doing with it now is genius, and they're nurturing and taking care of it. But like, it wasn't a visionary plan.
Right.
I think it's what makes Jensen really interesting and also somewhat controversial is most semiconductor CEOs. Well, one, they're mostly male, which is a whole other episode. But most of these guys they come up from the engineering side, and they're very good with the technical details, but they don't always hit with the vision. And Jensen is really, really good on big picture stuff. And I think what makes him so dangerous is that he can do both. He's not some flashy vision salesman. Ooh, big picture, big picture. He understands the details really well also.
Yep.
But the fact that he can do both, I think, though, every cycle it gets him in trouble, right? Because he really, like, every time I hear him speak, he wants to talk about the big vision.
Right.
And, meanwhile, investors, customers, channel partners are really interested in, like, looks like a lot of inventory in the channel. Should we do something about that? Like,
right.
There's a little bit of a disconnect. Every cycle he gets out over his skis on this.
He does. He does.
But that's me quibbling around the edges, because the big vision looks,
the product roadmap and the business model is just sound. I mean, that's the thing. Like, that's a very good company. Very, very well positioned for the long haul. And again, what they're going to do in CPU, I think, is going to be even more interesting. So, from what I've heard of other,
I agree, because I remember when they announced their CPU at their last analyst day, Like that wasn't even sort of top 10 headline
Yep.
from coming out of their event. Like, oh, and by the way, we're doing a CPU too. Like, to me, that was like that could be really, really powerful. And it just like shows they have this whole, they know what they're going. They're going after the data center. So let's do a CPU too. We're going to have our salespeople pitching our GPUs and our
Yep.
networking stuff. Let's just
Yep.
throw in a CPU too.
Yep. And we're both pretty bullish on ARM's opportunity in the data center. And as NVIDIA being a company that drives that tied to the GPU side could be super, super interesting. So, yeah. All right. So then I'm curious what you think then scenario wise happens with AMD. Do they stay small? Is it the kind of thing where, I mean, again, right, their only products are really just going to be data center, CPU, GPUs, and client CPU, GPUs in desktop computers, right? They don't have a lot beyond that.
So I think AMD is in a good place now. I'm just not as comfortable where they are sort of long term. I I think they've benefited in the last 7, 8 years from two important things. One is they have Lisa Su as CEO, and I think she is hugely underrated as a CEO. I mean, she
Yeah, I
really
agree.
turned it around, right?
Agreed.
I mean, for guys like our age, in the back of my head, I always think, oh, AMD, they're going to miss execute, right? Because for
Yep.
most of my life, they were missing product cycles,
That's right.
right? They haven't done that since she's been CEO. I mean, she's
Yeah.
completely turned around that culture, which is a huge accomplishment. The other thing that's benefited them is they've been able to eat Intel's lunch,
Yeah.
especially in the data center. And at some point, that runs out, either because Intel comes back, not going to happen, or they just like get to, as they get 80% of the market.
Yeah.
And and we talked about this last time, like the data center CPU market is shrinking as a
Yeah.
share of wallet.
Yeah.
So then now the question becomes the vision. What's sort of the big picture vision? And I think they're taking the right steps, right? They are broadening their product portfolio. They have FPGAs. They have other stuff coming in. They don't have quite as comprehensive a lineup portfolio
Yeah.
as Nvidia does.
Yeah.
They certainly don't have that dominance in anything AI. Like they really haven't tapped into that because they don't have CUDA, right? They're saying all the right things. Like they're talking about custom silicon and supporting customers. They're like doing all the things that you should have looked at as sort of strategy 101 for the
Yeah.
semiconductor industry. Like these are all things you need to do to prepare, but they're not really dominant or proven in a lot of those.
Yeah.
And so I think they're doing a great job, but I think there are a lot of questions about sort of what comes next.
Yep. Yeah, I'd agree. I think, again, they have some good IP. You're totally right. They've benefited from a combination of very good execution, which is coupled with a very good architecture. Because if you recall, they botched the prior one, which was Bulldozer. That was a hot mess. That got fixed with Ryzen. Ryzen solved a lot of problems and was a very, very good modern architecture at the right time. They didn't have to price themselves low. They were still now a more premium pricing player in data center. And so all those things combined with Lisa's execution helped. I would say, again, right, their upside, like you said, is can they take share from Intel in CPUs, in the desktop, client notebooks, as well as the data center. While I agree with you, I don't think, at least it's current execution plan. Scenario wise, maybe Intel can take some back, but they're not going to take it all back. Even if they don't take any back, I'm not sure Intel bleeds that much more share with some of the products that they have coming, but they're probably not going to get that back. So let's say Intel stays at 70-ish%, right, in client and in the data center. Again, not huge volumes, but certainly not full death. But AMD's growth story has to be to absorb get 50% of that, right, or more. I agree. Nobody's going to be back to 80, but you could see more balance. But it's a set market, right? CPUs, including data center, at best $350 million a year. That's a set market, right, for the most part. So economics itself would tell you, right, it's if you've got to take share, how big your growth is when, again, you just don't have adjacencies. You've kind of only got these two product roadmap paths.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. I agree with all of that except the Intel not losing more share part.
Okay. Well, we will see that will be a good conversation for a year. Okay, so let's go to. So let's talk a little bit more about Qualcomm from some growth areas, because we agree with them. Now, what if you had to bet? So we know where they're at in smartphones, and Cristiano's sort of overall, word to the street has always been, diversification of our business. Obviously, they still have a lot riding on smartphones, very similar to the way that Apple relies very heavily on iPhone revenue, but diversifies. Qualcomm's also diversifying. So their other businesses, automotive, IoT, with an emphasis on kind of premium IoT, being some of the adjacencies. Which one of those would you think is kind of the greater growth opportunity in the short term as kind of the next big blossoming business that's got a good CAGR on it?
I'm going with automotive.
Okay.
In part, I mean, near term, I get a little stuck on near term because near term maybe it's IoT, but I don't think anybody really understands what their IoT business
Yes,
is
that is
composed
true.
of. Like that's
That is true.
that's kind of a big black box.
Yeah.
But that maybe that does well in the near term. Long term, it's automotive, and the only problem with automotive is that those product cycles take a long time.
Yep.
But I think they're completely crushing it on the automotive side. They're winning everything. I was talking to somebody at MediaTek about this today, and they were just like in awe of every design win that comes up is Qualcomm. They have the right product.
Nice.
They have a coherent strategy. It is
Yeah. I think
it's impressive.
I know we're going to talk automotive at some point, but I think the current ballpark amount of semi content in automotive is like $650, $700, something like that, and it's projected to be, I want to say 1,500, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 by 25, 26. So doubling roughly semi content in automotive.
Okay. I have some problems with those numbers. I'll save those for a later date. But let's just use those. That's a decent thesis.
That was the last one I saw from a bank in terms of estimates. But regardless, it's hard to calculate. But let's just say it's going to grow. It's going to grow significantly. Yes. The amount of semi content in cars will be a rich market, and there are only a handful of companies that can get a good portion of that semi BOM, right? That share of content wallet, and Qualcomm's one of them. So I would agree with you there. I'm curious, so because you were there, and this is a dynamic that has sort of just happened in the last couple of years. So for anybody who's listening that doesn't know, Qualcomm has two main businesses: QTL, which is their licensing and IP business, and QCT, which is the Snapdragon product business. Now, QTL has remained relatively flat and is projected to stay flat. And the growth engine for the company is now QCT, so products that Qualcomm makes. And I think that's really interesting that shift has happened, and that management, mostly Cristiano, has been pushing on the growth engine being QCT now, their product side. But I'm curious, kind of how have you looked at that shift, right? Because for a long time it was always the licensing business was the big beast, and products were a part of it. But that shift has happened, and I think that's, like I said, I think that's super interesting. So I'm curious your thoughts on that shift.
I think some of it is sort of under the hood kind of stuff, because there was even before I was there was always this debate going on inside, like how much credit should QTL get? They're not doing the R&D work that's driving these patents. QCT, the product side, was saying, oh, we're doing all the R&D, we're the ones who are delivering all the patents that you guys are using to license. And so there was, I think it's at some point a few years ago, there was sort of a shift in how they accounted for those things and how they sort of presented those numbers. So that's a small part of it. But I think more fundamentally, they've just sort of reached a cap. They've reached a limit on how much how much they can grow that, right? And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
on the handset side, one, they're up against Apple, who didn't pay for a long time and still doesn't pay a huge rate.
Yeah.
Um, and then all their other customers, except for Samsung, are based in China, where they're operating under um, what's a polite way of putting it, sort of government suggestions on what those royalty rates should look like. Right? That was the whole part of their big settlement with the NDRC 10 years ago was
Right. It's capped. Yeah.
it was
It's a
capped.
capped rate. Yeah.
Right? And so then the other issue is they're now getting into more things, more devices, PCs, cars, IoT, on down the list. And in those contracts, they realized that if they were going to grow in those markets, they had to rethink their position on licensing. And what that sort of meant in practical terms is they put a ceiling on
Mm-hmm.
what their royalty would be. Because like in a phone, it's 5% of the BOM of a phone, or the FOB cost of the phone. 5% of a laptop is a much bigger number, and no one's going to pay that. And 5% of a car is nonsensical, and everybody knew that.
Right.
And so as they start expanding, there are much more volumes coming through things that are under those caps or under those ceilings. And I think that sort of flattens it out a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're totally right.
And
I think it's interesting. Where I think that's more interesting is the way in which it accelerates the product side of the business, right? From a QCT standpoint, and where I would have been sensitive to this debate a few years ago, which was, and this came up, I'm sure it came up right when you were there, which was to the degree that you make products that sometimes then compete with those who license your IP to make other products, right? And it's not like people are licensing IP for them to go make CPUs and GPUs, some of the other things, but there's licenses of other areas of their portfolio where they're going to make products. So that was the rub, but that's completely off the table now. It's really like QCT is the growth driver. They will productize as many pieces of the pipe that they can productize in order to get more of that share of wallet for every category. And it's full blown now. The growth engine is QCT.
It's probably for the best.
I would agree. Last question on Qualcomm, and it was because it's near and dear to your heart, are they making a tactical error not having a data center CPU?
In Cristiano's Qualcomm, I think that is it would make no sense for them to have a data center CPU.
Okay.
There's no need because look at what we've just been talking about. AMD, Nvidia, all these other companies are building, end-to-end data center solutions. Qualcomm doesn't have any of that, right? They don't have a data center CPU. They don't have a GPU.
Right.
They don't have any networking. There was a point 10 years ago where they could have gone down that path, but they would have had to build a CPU and then acquire a handful of companies to sort of cobble it together. And they made the decision not to. And I think they now have a vision of a direction for the company where they don't need that.
Yep. Agreed.
Because for today's cars they have Snapdragon, which works really well. Eventually they're going to need something for autonomy.
Yeah,
but they can buy that. They don't need that today. They don't need a data center CPU to get to autonomy.
Yeah,
right. And so there's no point in having it.
Yeah. My only initial thinking and logic was, since they have the Nvidia team now, they theoretically could have a good core. But you're right in that there's so many other pieces of that component that they don't have, that probably muddies the waters. I'll be curious to see how successful they are on the incumbents x86 on the laptop side with the CPU part for laptops, and see what kind of share and volume they can get of notebooks, because that will be interesting. But again, it's not, they're not going to completely displace massive amounts of Intel or AMD, but they could take some share on notebooks.
I will say this. I think the one thing that gives me a little bit of hesitation, a little concern about Qualcomm is the way in which they've prioritized tasks for the Nuvia team, right? Because it's PCs first, then auto,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Mm-hmm.
mobile last, or maybe auto and mobile are switched. But like PC was the first product they were tasked with,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't understand that because like to your point, PCs are they're never going to be a huge number of ARM based Qualcomm CPU laptops out there. It's a small market and it's not a growing market. Auto, we can argue, yeah, that's important, but also you got plenty of time.
Yep.
The company makes what 80% of its revenue from things attached to smartphone Snapdragon. Why isn't
Yep.
that the number one priority? And especially when you look at it in the context of Apple with the N series applications processor, like that is what 2 years ahead of where the current Snapdragon
Roughly
is,
18
right?
months, 2 years. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that gap has just been growing, like it's been growing for a long time. And
Yeah.
so, I mean, I understand like Apple has all kinds of advantages. They own the software and the hardware, and they can have an advantage. But like the thing that concerns me is that Qualcomm management just doesn't seem too concerned about that, right? And so they're letting Nuvia sort of get to that eventually. I would have thought that that Snapdragon and having the best processor would be critically important because it um, all of Qualcomm's other customers are competing with Apple, and they're the best silicon they can get, the best application processor they get is 2 years behind where their biggest competitor is. And so that's a really, really bad place for Oppo and Vivo and Xiaomi to be. And uh, Qualcomm's not in a hurry to fix that. And as a result, all of those companies are now designing their own applications processors. They're going to have a hard time with it, but they've sort of been forced into this camp where they have to compete with Apple, and so they're going to build their own chips.
Yeah.
And
I
so,
mean, I think yeah, you're absolutely right. They're gonna struggle. It is interesting if you noticed what they did with Samsung in that the new S23s are run on a Snapdragon that is optimized for Galaxy, meaning that it is very similar to what they did with Microsoft and the SQ product for Surface, where it's basically throttled up, a little bit more efficient. Looks to be benchmarking actually pretty well, not that far off from Apple. I thought that was really interesting, to be honest with you, that was, I'm not going to say it's semi-custom because I think there's more going on in terms of it's accelerated and others might get to use something similar. But I thought that was a very, very interesting approach because that's been something I've wondered, for some time. Like look at Samsung, for example, right? You knew that Google's Tensor CPU in their Pixel phones was a collaboration with Samsung, just a beefed up version of Exynos, and how Qualcomm and or others need to do maybe more like this, right? To give some specific differentiation, some tweaks and customizations in order to do exactly what you said, which is help compete with Apple. I think is actually really interesting. I'm not, not enough for me to say, hey, it's a big trend, but it's interesting enough that I took note. Like, is this kind of what you need to do now as a merchant vendor to help your customers more differentiate in these pockets where competition is super rich, right? Especially with Apple.
yeah, I think we're getting to the heart of the problem, which is it's none of these companies. It's Google is the real root of the issue, right? Because
You mean
Apple's
Android?
advantage, well, no, yeah, Android, because
Okay.
Apple's advantage is that it ties the silicon to the operating system so tightly.
Yeah.
And for Qualcomm or anyone to do that, they would need to get Google to engage. And I think that's the root. That's the heart of it. Is that Google?
With more
I think
optimizations. Yeah.
Google just doesn't seem inclined to do that. They don't. I mean, like, I don't think they know what to do with Android. Um, it's it's a messy problem for them. It's expensive and it's not real. It's not directly revenue generating, and it's Google. They have a short attention span, and so it's always mystified me for why Qualcomm and Google aren't much closer. Um, and there's all kinds of reasons for it. Some strategic, some personal. But it's just a weird, like you'd think that like Google Android plus Qualcomm Snapdragon would be the Wintel of the
That's
mobile era,
yeah.
but that's never
Yeah.
it's never gone down that path.
That's an interesting take. Interesting takeaway. All right, we will leave it at that. We've talked about the power brokers. I'm glad there was some debate and disagreement that makes for more engaging. Listeners had asked how to comment. I think, two things. One, you can always just send us feedback or questions on Twitter. But also, I've said this before, we have a YouTube channel. You want to look at our wonderful faces. I'm scraggly at the moment from being sick and not shaving in a while. But you can comment on our YouTube channel, and we can talk there. So that's alternate options. But thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.
Good talking. All right. Have a good one, everybody, and talk to you next week.